All right, thank you. It is such an honor to be here, both at this celebratory occasion, but also in this distinguished company of the other panelists. So I'm grateful to be here and to be able to talk to you a little bit about my research. So I'm here to speak about some of what is a larger project on both on women in international society, gender in international society, but more specifically this new research project on diplomacy. Right? The focus of my talk will be on women, so I'm sorry, Joshua. I do work on men and masculinity also, but today I wanted to focus on women. And I wanted to think about women in diplomacy and to think about that in a global and a historical context. So what I'll give you is this really big and sweeping picture of women in diplomacy, just to place some of what we've heard in the kind of bigger context of what has happened over time and what's happening internationally and globally. And I think to understand this, we have to think about and place women in diplomacy in the context of how states have changed, right? How the state has become a global entity, how it's developed, how it's changed, right? And how women, what kind of place women have taken in public office and in state office. And here I think it's helpful to start thinking about the standard story about women in states in the world of women's political empowerment. There are a lot of stories circulating thinking that for millennia, right, there's a tradition of patriarchy, that for millennia, for thousands of years, women have been shut out of politics and political office. This is a global kind of shared history, right? And then when you think that then with the Enlightenment, right, in the 1800s, 1900s, right, as the Enlightenment took hold, women in Europe, right, broke free of this first, maybe through some of the liberal reforms, right, and that women in the West then demanded political rights through the suffrage movements and so forth, so that women in the West were first liberated, and then this was to spread globally throughout the world. And that diplomacy then will be a part of this story of like a shared past of patriarchy, European women leading the way, right, breaking free from this, and then teaching other women around the world about their political rights. Let's see if I can make this work. What I have to say shows quite a different story of this. I would like to challenge the standard narrative, and I'd like to challenge you to think about both kind of the political history of women and the diplomatic history of women differently. Because if we take a look at all the research that exists in anthropological history, native history, and so forth, the history of gender relations in Africa, Native America, right, and other parts of the world, we see that in the 18th and 19th century, right, there was not a world that shared kind of a patriarchal oppression of women in politics. Instead, we saw all kinds of different types of gender arrangements, right, that there was a diversity. We saw multiple kinds of political organizations, and those in turn rested on a variety of gender arrangements, right, that sometimes had exclusively male rule, but other times also included female political leadership. Strict matriarchal polities, in other words, polities in which title holders were exclusively female and political power exercised solely by women, that seems to have been very rare. I've never seen an instance of that, right? So we don't have any all-female kind of political systems. But what we have is a range from patriarchal, male-only state polities, right, to gender-mixed or gender-balanced systems. And that's quite different than saying that, you know, there's a shared global history of female exclusion. So let's take a really quick look at that. Again, this is very sweeping, right? But 18th and 19th century, we see a range of societies with gender-balanced polities, okay? So for instance, the monarchies of West Africa, Native American tribes, Austronesian societies in Asia, and more, rested on arrangements that often had dual stool systems. So for each political office or each public office, there would be one female and one male stool. Okay? So it would be a shared arrangement. And some of these societies, furthermore, had flexible gender arrangements so that women could take on a male role, right? You could be a male daughter or a male woman. And in that way, you could also move into the male sphere of politics. Then we had a range of societies that were gender mixed, but male dominated, right? Some of these are in the monarchies of East Africa, present-day Kenya, Zambia, but also some in West Africa. Okay? In these societies, Majority of the political office were held by men, but there were also women involved in politics. Then we have what we assume to be universal, the male-dominated societies with very few women. These include the larger empires, China, Korea, Persia, Ottoman Empire, right? These are the big, powerful empires. Here, women did not often hold public office, right? So here, and these societies obviously also have a history, right? So it's a reason we came to this. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, they were largely male-dominated. So then the question, of course, is what was the situation in Europe? Right? Europe during this time, we can see, was restrictive for women, right? During absolutism, this is when, right, it's really the monarchies of Europe, when all power was vested in the sovereign, the king or queen. They were restrictive, but they were not uniform. There was no standardized kind of expectations for men and women in politics in Europe at this time either. We had some countries that had male preference succession, right? But queen regents were allowed as exceptions, right? So we saw in England and Scotland, for instance, the Habsburg Empire, Monaco, Russia, Spain, we had female queens at a time when all state power was vested in the sovereign, right? So this is not just symbolics, right? This was actual power. Then we had other countries in Europe that had all male succession, with no queen regents allowed at all. Right? They rested on a different tradition. There was a sense of no separation of the physical body of the king and the actual state. Reproduction of the state went through male semen and so forth. Very different tradition, right? Resting on Salic law and so forth. At this time, diplomacy was not an all-male sphere, and this is important to remember because this is about diplomacy, right? So during this period, ties to the royal courts were pivotal for diplomatic credentials. So diplomatic interactions among elites took place in networks of both men and women, right? So in this context, women of the high European nobility could exercise diplomatic influence, and they carried out many diplomatic tasks. They were trained in letter writing for official documents. They were trained to give speeches to foreign officials and so forth. So there were a range of women with relations to the courts that were involved in foreign relations and that served important diplomatic functions throughout the 17th and 18th century. Okay? Women, as one of my colleagues has shown, filled similar function also in the Ottoman Empire. And there were even occasionally women that were appointed as ambassadors during this period. So what we have then is a history that's much more heterogeneous and complex. We don't have a history. We need to complicate this, right? It's not a history of shared kind of patriarchal oppression where women had no role in diplomacy, but a history where there was room for women in politics in some societies and in the European system where women did have a role in diplomacy. Not equal, but they were there, okay? Then something happened, right? 19th century. Then we saw a shift to male political rule, and that shift then became global, right? In Europe, this was the time where we had the big democratic breakthroughs, right? The state turned into the constitutional state. It was no longer just focused on kings and so forth, right? And with that came the exclusion of women, okay? So paradoxically perhaps, as states became more democratic and more open to the public, they also became less accessible for women, right? So what we saw was in Europe during the 19th century, just a wave of explicit and full-scale bans on the participation of women in politics or from holding public office, right? So we saw all these new laws developing. Second, so what we came to was then a standardized situation in Europe, which all European states said, no, women may not participate as voters, they can't hold public office and so forth, and this was enshrined in law. At the same time, this was the era, right, where European colonialism was intensifying. Europe was acquiring new territories, right, in Africa, they were acquiring new territories in Asia, right? So the impact, of course, in these societies where women had shared political office was devastating, right? So there was a reorganization then of political office in colonized areas, which was severe, right? It was a fundamental restructuring of political authority as male. So, in other words, all the women that had power were sidelined in the new colonial administrative systems, and men were put in place, right, in their stead. During the same period, we see similar shifts in diplomacy. This is when the modern ministries for foreign affairs developed, right? Where you had professionalized foreign service officials. With that development, women were squeezed out also from foreign service. So women lost much of their former influence in diplomacy. So instead, we saw all male diplomatic interactions. Women served primarily as diplomatic wives, right? Carrying out important functions, but they were unpaid and they were seen as peripheral. After that, we have the 20th century, which I'm sure you're all aware was the century of the global struggles for women's inclusion or re-inclusion, as I would like to call it in some cases, right? This is where we had the huge transnational suffrage movements. We had fights for women, right, to be included in political office and so forth. And interesting here, as women gained access to state power in the early 20th century, there were often three exceptions, right? It was the military, which Joshua has talked about, priesthood, and diplomacy. Those were the three things that women could not join. These were institutions that were much more resistant, much more slow to open up to women, right? So Karin and I, in our forthcoming book, we're trying to show some of this history, trying to piece together, like, when did diplomacy change, really, and open up to women? And you can see that in the 1920s through the 1950s is when the ban on women's entry into foreign service was lifted. And here Sweden was relatively late. We opened the doors to women in 1948, so we were not in the forefront of this development. After the ban was lifted, there was still a ban on women in many countries from being married and serving as a diplomat at the same time, the so-called marriage ban. That was not lifted until the 1970s. That's late, right? So you had to choose between a career or a marriage. Right? That then was lifted, and then late compared to a lot of other public office, we see in the 2000s, we see the number of women rapidly increasing. And very rapidly so in some countries, right? Sweden has now 56%, I think, women of the workers in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs are women, right? So we have a majority, female majority MFA, right? But there are a number of other states too that have seen a rapid increase, right, in women in the last 2 or 3 decades. So the question that I'm asking then is, what does the situation look like today, right, for women in diplomacy? We don't really know, and that's what my project is about, and I have recruited a few colleagues that work with me on this. And one dimension of this is the simple mapping, right? So we asked the same question that Foreign Minister Wallström just posed before. Where are the women in diplomacy, right? They're in, but where do they end up? So together with a colleague at Gothenburg, we started with ambassadors, right? Just to get a sense. Started a database. We only have 2014 so far. We've coded 7,000 ambassador appointments to get a sense of how many ambassadors are female and male, where are they posted, and so forth. I thought I'd show you a little of that. So in 2014, we're still only at 15% female ambassador, and this is the apex of a diplomatic career, right? This is the finest position one can reach. So it's still just 15%, but as we can see, it varies a great deal between regions, right? The Nordic countries, not surprisingly, are at the top, right? It varies among the Nordic countries. Sweden have a few, I think we're closer to 40% now, maybe. Denmark is lagging a little behind. Asia, only 10% female ambassadors sent from Asia. Varies a lot there too. The Philippines has almost 30% female ambassadors. South America, same variation, 16% average. Colombia has, I think, 28% female ambassadors. So there's a great deal of variation within the regions, but we can also see regional differences here. Europe, with the exception of the Nordic countries, not doing so great. Right? Europeans are not really the role model in this respect. Right? They're slightly below average, in fact. Then the next question we're asking is, where do women end up then? Now, we know they're here, right? But where do they end up? Do they end up in ambassador positions of power and prestige? Or do they end up in the less prestigious ambassador positions and postings? Right? So that's also a question that, together with Birgitta Niklasson, colleague at Gothenburg, that we've asked. So by status, then, what does that mean? Of course, that varies a bit country to country. I mean, some countries might consider a certain posting very prestigious, whereas others might not. A neighboring country, a trade intense, and so forth. But we did just a simple look at GDP rank. In other words, how important, how big is the economy, and how big is your military, right? Just to get a sense of what are the economically and the militarily most powerful countries, to see, do women end up at the same rate in those postings, or are postings like Washington, D.C., Moscow, and so forth, all male, right? The answer to this is that by and large, it seems that female ambassadors have the same chances as men overall, right? So not huge differences, but they are, I mean, I don't know if you can see these pictures or tables, they are underrepresented in the most prestigious positions. So what we did here is we divided, right, the top 50 countries, divided them into groups of 5, and then we wanted to see, right, the representation of male and female ambassadors in each grouping. And what we can see here is that group 1, those are the most prestigious postings, so the highest military rank and the highest economic rank. In that particular group, we see that women are underrepresented as ambassadors, which suggests, right, that there's some sort of glass ceiling still, perhaps, right? That still the very kind of the core, most important arenas, right, are still not as open to women. Because we see this as a consistent pattern. We turn and twisted this data in a number of different ways, and it comes out the same way each time. Right? So the next step for us then is to look more comparatively at specific states to try to explain variation. We're trying to look at this in different ways, right? Sweden, for instance, has, for some reason, even though there's so many women in the Swedish Foreign Service, we have a much stronger pattern, right? So it seems like there's bigger differences between where men and women end up in the Swedish MFA than it is in other states. And we're curious about why that is, given that we know that we have leadership that's committed and has been committed to gender equality for some time, right? So there might be other mechanisms at work here. Then, next, I'm just going to end with questions for you to ponder, because the next, I mean, the final, where I'm going next with the project as a whole is to think about gender, right, and feminist foreign policy in diplomatic interactions. I'm very interested in kind of the state-to-state interactions when state representatives meet, right? What are the gender dynamics of those? So for instance, what has happened to diplomacy, the mundane, the everyday, the routine interactions between state representatives of different countries as women join in increasingly large numbers? Right? We know this is a masculinized space. It's not militarized masculinity, but it's masculinized. It's been male only for well over 100 years. What happens when you add women to that mix? Right? We know there can be trouble, right? We know there's been all sorts of trouble around dress, for instance, whether you cover your hair or not when you go to Iran with the females on your delegation, right? We know the Iranian diplomat that was in Germany, right? She was caught shaking hands with her German counterpart. It was a picture back home in Iran. There was an outcry. They were shaking hands, right, with a man, presumably. Then it turned out the person she was shaking hands with was not a man. It was a woman that the Iranians thought was a man. So this is all, it's interesting in many layers, right? But then there are ways in which you establish networks, connections, male connections, right? How golfing, grabbing a beer at a bar, meeting at a sauna, what have you, right? Dress and behavior. Right? So what of these are masculinized institutions? How do they affect women's ability to be effective, right, as diplomats? Another, and I will wrap up with this, final question that we're interested in takes us as a starting point, this increasing polarization around gender issues that we're seeing, right? There's a worrying development in which in Poland, Hungary, Russia, right, and the populist right forces in the rest of Europe and North America, they're resistant now. They're resisting feminism. Even the term gender itself is seen as something terrible, right? So in that context, right, how do Swedish diplomats or other diplomats who are trying to promote gender equality, promote a feminist foreign policy in these very hostile environments? How do you frame and adapt a message for it to be effective? And how do you do that when there are stories circulating that we're the rape capital of the world, right? How do you initiate? How do you negotiate? How do you reach an audience in that kind of context? It's another set of questions that we're asking. And I think I'll end it at that, since I have time. Thank you.